The door of the Cascade had barely swung shut behind him when Staff Sergeant Birch decided he had already read the room and understood it completely. That was his first mistake. The bar sat 14 kilometers outside the main gate of Joint Base Lewis-McChord, on a two-lane stretch of highway that the rain had been working on since mid-afternoon. It was the kind of place that made no effort at ambience, cracked vinyl stools, a jukebox cycling through a playlist nobody had updated in a decade, walls hung with unit patches, and photographs yellowed just enough to look earned rather than decorative. On any given Friday evening, the clientele was exactly what you would expect this close to a base. Off-duty soldiers, a handful of veterans, local regulars who had been coming long enough that nobody questioned their presence. The noise in the room was comfortable and self-contained, the particular volume of people who understood hard work and the specific kind of unwinding that follows it. Strand was sitting at the far end of the bar. She had chosen the stool closest to the wall, shoulders angled inward, a glass of water in front of her. Not beer, not whiskey, just water. She wore a plain dark jacket over a crewneck shirt, civilian clothes that fit with the ease of someone who spent most of their time in uniform and had stopped caring what they looked like out of it. Her hair was pulled back without ceremony. There were lines at the corners of her eyes that had less to do with age than with years of scanning horizons in poor light and concentrating on things that required complete concentration. She was 35 years old, though she looked both younger and older, depending on the moment, the angle, and whether or not she was paying attention to you. She had driven 40 minutes to get here, not for the ambience, not for the company, simply because the apartment she had been renting since separating from active duty 3 weeks earlier had a particular quality of silence that contained nothing restful in it. The held-breath silence of a space is waiting for something that was not going to happen, and being among strangers, even loud ones, was occasionally preferable to that. Birch had been drinking since before she arrived. He was with a group of 5 in the back corner, tall, broad-shouldered, the kind of man who moved through public spaces as though mildly surprised they hadn't been cleared in advance. His civilian clothes had the stiffness of things worn infrequently and without enthusiasm. Special forces she had assessed within 30 seconds of their arrival, or Rangers, possibly out of a Western posting, based on 2 of the sleeve T tattoos she had caught in passing. The energy was right. That combination of trained restlessness and social overconfidence that comes from spending too much time in environments where aggression is a professional asset. She had nothing against them. She had worked alongside men from nearly every special operations unit in the American military, and some that weren't officially American. She simply, that evening, had no interest in being around them. She turned back to her water. The noise in the corner got louder. Birch came to the bar the way men like him tended to approach things they had already decided to have, with the unhurried confidence of someone who had rarely been seriously refused. He slid onto the stool beside her and offered the kind of smile that was less an expression than a statement of intent. "You've been sitting here a while," he said. "Not really a solo kind of place." She looked at her glass, water. "Right, a beach still." "I'm good," she said, "thanks." She felt the shift in him before it became visible, the slight compression in the pause, the recalibration that was not a retreat. She had felt it before, many times, and she understood precisely what it signaled. The moment when a man who expected a particular social transaction realized he was not going to receive it and had to decide what to do with that. Some men made the right choice. They found a graceful exit, preserved their dignity, went back to their group with a shrug and an easy story. Birch was not in the mood for the right choice. "No need to be rude about it," he said. His voice had changed, still surface-level pleasant, but with something underneath it that had hardened. "Just trying to be friendly." "I know," Strand said. "I'd rather be left alone." "Yeah, well." He leaned slightly forward. "You could act like you mean it without making it a whole thing." She said nothing. She picked up her water glass and took a slow sip, set it back down with the careful precision of someone who did everything carefully and precisely. The problem, as she read it, was the group in the corner, 5 men watching, because men like Birch did not have private conversations. Everything was performance. Everything was for the audience, and the audience was waiting for the resolution they expected, for the social transaction to complete, the way social transactions were supposed to complete. She looked at him for the first time, directly, without expression. Not with anger, not with anything that could be read as weakness or invitation. Just a clean, flat assessment of someone deciding how much of a problem this was going to be. "Go back to your group," she said. Birch looked at her for a moment. Then he did something that 30 years of better choices might have prevented, and one night of bad ones made feel like logic. He grabbed her wrist. Not violently, not at first. It was the grab of someone who believed that physical contact would reestablish a social dynamic he felt slipping. That if she wouldn't respond to his words, her body might respond to his hand on it. What happened next took approximately 4 seconds. She rotated her wrist outward at an angle that broke his grip through geometry rather than force, came off the bar, stool in a single smooth motion, caught his forearm and applied leverage at his elbow in a direction elbows are not designed to travel. The stool scraped back. Birch's breath came out in a sharp, involuntary sound. He went down to one knee with the expression of a man who had just discovered that the floor is much closer than expected. The jukebox kept playing. The bar did not. Every conversation in the room had stopped. The bartender, a retired infantry corporal named Crew, who had been running the Cascade for 11 years and had seen enough to write a book about it, took 2 deliberate steps back and put his hand near the phone. He didn't reach for it. Something in the quality of what he was watching told him that reaching for it would be premature. Strand released Birch's arm and stepped back. Not far, 1 step, measured. She looked at the group in the corner. None of them had moved. One of them, a heavy-set man in his early 40s with the posture of someone considerably more experienced than the rest, was watching her hands. Not her face, not Birch on the floor. Her hands the way a person watches something they have learned to read, as the most reliable indicator of what a situation actually is. His face was very still. She would learn later that his name was Laval. "I'm going to settle my tab," Strand said to Crew. Her voice was the same temperature it had been the entire evening. "What do I owe you?" "Nothing." Crew shook his head slowly. "Not a thing." She put a 20 on the bar anyway. Then she reached into her jacket pocket and set something down beside the glass. A coin, matte finished, about the weight and size of a silver dollar, which she had been holding in her hand for the last 2 minutes, the way she sometimes held things when she needed something solid and real beneath the noise. She left it there without comment and without ceremony. Then she walked out. The door closed. The rain took her. Laval crossed to the bar before anyone else had moved. He picked up the coin and held it in the light. The face showed an eagle over crossed arrows. Below them, a motto in lettering too small to read at a distance, and a unit designation that his brain initially refused to process, not because it was obscured, but because it represented something that existed at the outermost edge of what was officially acknowledged. He had heard of the unit. Everyone in special operations had heard of it, in the way you hear about things that move through professional circles, as rumor and inference rather than documented fact. He had never expected to hold physical evidence of it. He looked at Birch, still on one knee, cradling his arm. "Get up," Laval said. His voice was very quiet. "We need to leave." He set the coin back on the bar with a care that was out of proportion to the situation. If you didn't understand what the coin represented, if you did understand, the care was exactly right. Laval did not sleep that night. He lay on the hotel bedspread, fully dressed, and stared at the ceiling with the focused intensity of a man running calculations that kept shifting variables. He kept returning to the same moment, not the confrontation which replayed in his memory with the precision of surveillance footage. He kept returning to her eyes in the moment after. Not anger, not adrenaline. The pressurized stillness of someone who had assessed the situation, found it manageable, and was now simply deciding how much of a response the problem required. He had seen that quality once before, at a training evaluation in a location he was not supposed to name, demonstrated by an operator whose file he had never been cleared to access. At 04:30, he reached for his phone and called a number stored under a first name only, Paulson, a former JOC intelligence liaison who now worked in a role described as administrative and which Laval understood to mean something considerably less administrative than that. "Laval," the voice said after 4 rings. "This better matter." Unit insignia, eagle over crossed arrows. Designation I could barely read in the light. She left a coin on the bar. The silence that followed was specific. It was the silence of recognition, not confusion. Where did you see this? A woman left it behind, mid-30s, lean, dark hair. She put Birch on the floor in about 4 seconds without raising her voice or breaking a sweat. A longer silence. Laval Paulson said carefully, "What did your people do tonight? Tell me what you know." "Nothing official. You understand that?" "I understand." A slow exhale. "There's a name that circulates in the right circles without appearing in writing. Female operator, not support, not adjacent operator, attached to a special operations element with no public-facing designation. Her file, to whatever extent a file exists, is the kind of thing that makes very senior people go quiet when it comes up." A pause. "The name that moves with the description you're giving me is Strand." Laval's grip tightened on the phone. Something settled in the room around him. "What else moves with it?" Paulson breathed out carefully. "A mission 4, maybe 5 years ago. Joint Operational Theater, classified tier. Something went wrong. The operational documentation doesn't surface through any channel I can access. But what moved through the community afterward? And understand, this is the kind of story that grows in the retelling, is that she was the last one out, that she carried someone out, and that she went back in 72 hours later to complete the mission objectives alone." Laval closed his eyes. "The person she carried," he said. "A sniper, young, exceptionally capable, name of Aldous. She had trained him herself." Laval sat on the edge of the bed until the light outside shifted from black to gray. He was thinking about Birch, about the particular kind of pride that masquerades as confidence and what it costs a man over time, not what it costs the people around him, but what it costs the man himself. The slow erosion of judgment that happens when deference is mistaken for reality. At 0612, his phone buzzed with a message from his unit's training coordination officer. "Mandatory Joint Readiness Assessment. Reporting time 0700. Location, classified training facility. Instructor TBA." Laval read the timestamp, 0601. 90 minutes after his call with Paulson. He did not believe in coincidence, not in the military and not in this context. He went to knock on Birch's door. The facility was the kind of place that exists on no public map and has a gate staffed by people who don't make small talk. The receiving officer, a Navy commander named Hadfield, had the kind of face that had arrived at severity, so gradually it appeared to have always been there. He stood at the entrance to the main briefing room with a clipboard and looked at each of them in turn, with the patient inventory of a man who had long ago decided that first impressions were data. "Ranger element," he said, not a greeting, a categorization. They filed in. Metal chairs, projection screen, white walls. The particular institutional quality of a space designed entirely for function. The screen showed a name. Staff Sergeant Marin Strand, USA, RET Special Operations Combat Instructor. The silence in the room had a texture, 6 men processing the same information at different speeds. Laval looked at the door. He did not look at Birch. One of the younger soldiers, Corporal Ingram, 22 years old, one deployment, the one who had gone down second in the bar, said very quietly, "Is that?" "Yes," Laval said. The door opened. Strand walked in full tactical kit, dark and minimal, selected for function rather than appearance. Her hair was pulled back. Her face was composed and entirely neutral. The bruise along her jaw, faint, purpling slightly at the edge, occupied the room without announcing itself. It was simply present, a physical fact that existed alongside every other fact in the room. She stood at the front and looked at them. Nobody looked away. "Yesterday," she said, "you made an assumption about what I was. That is your first lesson." Her voice was even and clear, carrying no theatrical weight whatsoever. "Assumptions in the field have a body count, not hypothetically, specifically. I have stood at a graveside for a man who died because the people around him decided they understood the situation and stopped looking at what it actually was." She walked one step forward. "My name is Marin Strand. I spent 14 years in special operations. I have conducted direct action missions in 6 countries, 3 of which I cannot name in this room. I have been the last person standing in situations where the statistical probability of that outcome was not in my favor." A pause. "I am not here to humiliate you. I want to say that clearly at the beginning, because what comes next is going to feel like humiliation. That is not its function." She looked at Birch, not longer than she looked at any of the others. Just an even, deliberate moment of professional contact. Its function, she continued, looking back at the group, is to show you what you don't know. Because what you don't know right now could end every person in this room within 60 seconds of real contact. A silence. Do you believe me, Staff Sergeant Birch? He straightened involuntarily, ma'am. She waited with the patience of someone who understands that the right kind of silence does more work than any words, and she let it fill the room and do its work. Something cracked in Birch's expression, not dramatically, not visibly to anyone less attentive than Laval. The first pressure fracture in a surface that had been under the wrong kind of load for a long time. Yes, ma'am, he said. Good, she said, then let's begin. What followed over the next 4 days was the most systematically disorienting training evolution any of them had experienced, and between 6 men they had experienced a substantial range. Strand did not teach the way they expected. She did not lecture. She built situations, watched how they moved through them, and then asked questions so precise that the answers arrived not as information she was delivering, but as realizations the men were having themselves. She found the gap in each man's thinking, not his technique, his thinking, and applied steady, patient pressure until the gap became visible to its owner. It was uncomfortable in a specific way that was impossible to resent, because the only thing being asked of each man was to look honestly at his own decisions. Birch was technically competent. That was never in question. Rangers were always technically competent, but she watched him operate and saw what Laval had begun to suspect, that his intelligence had fallen into the habit of deferring to his ego at precisely the moments when it could least afford to. When the assessment was most critical, when the situation was most ambiguous, he defaulted not to discipline but to confidence. And confidence that has never been genuinely tested is just a feeling wearing armor. On the evening of day 2, after a debrief that had run close to 2 hours and dissected every decision point in a morning exercise with the methodical care of someone removing something fragile from wreckage, Laval found Strand standing at the window of the briefing room, looking at the dark training ground outside. The inquiry, he said. Paulson mentioned there was one. She turned. Her expression didn't change. How much did he tell you? Enough to know someone is trying to reframe the mission where Aldous died. A silence. Yes, she said. And they're using him to do it. Her jaw tightened once and then released. That was the only visible thing. But Laval understood it the way you understand a transmission from a system operating at its absolute limit of capacity. There's a formal inquiry scheduled for after this evolution concludes, she said. Someone inside the intelligence architecture of that mission has submitted an alternate account of the critical decision point, suggesting that what happened to Aldous was a pre-planned operational choice rather than a real-time call under contact. She stopped, chose the next words with precision, that his position was not accidental. Laval said nothing. He was 23 years old, Strand said. Her voice stayed level. The flatness of it was itself a measure of how much control the delivery required. He was the best sniper I ever trained. He made terrible coffee, which he was very proud of for reasons I never understood. He read poetry on deployment, which nobody was allowed to know about, and he fell asleep in under 5 minutes anywhere, in any conditions, which I hated and envied in roughly equal measure. She looked at the window. In 4 years of review and counter-review, the worst 40 seconds of my life have been reduced to a variable in someone else's political calculation. She said it in the same register she used to describe training errors. That was what made Laval go very still. I'm going in to testify after the final exercise, she said, alone. No, Laval said, you're not. She looked at him. Give me 48 hours, he said. What Laval did with those 48 hours was methodical and quiet and involved a second call to Paulson, who involved 2 additional contacts, one of whom had been present at the original after-action review of the mission and had been silent about the alternate account for 3 years because silence had seemed like the path with the lowest cost. It is remarkable, sometimes, what changes when someone simply asks. The final exercise on day 5 concluded at 0730. Birch led the primary team element on the objective approach, and he made one decision in the last 8 minutes that Strand noted in her field notebook under his name with the annotation. Not instinct, choice, correct choice. Note the difference. After the debrief, Laval found her in the corridor outside the briefing room. Paulson called back, he said. 3 people have filed sworn statements with a federal oversight office, separate from the inquiry: an intelligence officer, a logistic commander, and a ground element warrant officer who was in the operational area. All 3 corroborate the original operational account. All 3 state the alternate version is inconsistent with the documented record at every material point. Strand was still for several seconds. "When were the statements filed?" she said. 600 this morning, before the inquiry was scheduled to begin. Laval watched her absorb this, watched the thing that had been under pressure in her face all week, managed with such total professional control that most people in the room probably hadn't seen it, find in 3 sworn statements and 1 corridor conversation its first genuine release valve. "Daniel Aldous deserved better than 4 years of this," she said. "Yes," Laval said, "he did." She went into the inquiry at 1,000 hours in service dress, back straight, hands steady, the bruise on her jaw still faint but present. She answered every question in the same flat, factual register she used to describe training errors. When they placed the alternate account in front of her, she read it without changing her expression, set it down and said, "That account is false in every material particular. I have nothing to add to the corroborating statements already on record, because the truth does not require supplementation." A pause. "What I would ask is that this inquiry extended Daniel Aldous's service record, the same standard of factual honesty I have extended to my own testimony. He cannot speak for himself. That means the rest of us have to be careful about who speaks for him." She said it. Then she stopped talking. The inquiry officer looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at the man beside him. Something passed between them. The silent recalibration of people who have just discovered their evidentiary foundation is considerably less stable than they believed. Birch was waiting outside when she came out. Not alone, Laval was there, and Ingram and the other 3, the whole group in a loose, quiet cluster with the patient quality of people who have somewhere to be later and have decided that this matters more right now. Birch had 2 paper cups of coffee. He held one out. Strand looked at the cup, then at him, then at the group behind him. "Ingram found a place 3 blocks over," Birch said. "It's not good coffee." She took it. "Thank you." They stood outside in the gray morning light, all 7 of them, in the particular kind of quiet that exists after something significant has concluded and before the next thing has declared itself. After a while, Birch said, without looking at her, "I owe you an apology I don't have the right words for yet." "I know," she said. "I'm working on finding them." "I know that too." He looked down at his coffee cup. He had something in his jacket pocket, his grandfather's regimental coin, worn smooth along the edges, something he'd carried for 6 years as a kind of talisman. He didn't fully understand why he was taking it out now. He did it anyway. "My grandfather told me once that there are 2 kinds of strong," he said. "The kind that makes you feel bigger by making people around you smaller, and the kind that makes you bigger by making the people around you bigger." He turned the coin over once. He said most men spend their whole lives confusing the first for the second, and that the ones who figured out the difference were the ones worth following. He held it out to her. She looked at it for a moment. Then she took it, turned it once between her fingers, and put it in the same jacket pocket where she kept her field notebook. She looked at him the way a person looks at something they have decided to invest in, not because it's finished, but because they can see what it might become. "Come back better," she said. Not a wish, a requirement. The kind of thing a real instructor says to a real student when the lesson has been received with enough honesty to be trusted with something that matters. Birch nodded once. The coffee was bad. Nobody mentioned it. They finished it in the gray morning light before the next thing found its shape. Strand was the last one to her vehicle. She sat for a moment before starting the engine, her hands loose on the wheel, her field notebook open in her lap to a new page. She uncapped her pen and wrote 1 line. Then she capped the pen and looked at it. She had not wanted the last 3 weeks to go the way they had gone. She had wanted quiet and rest and the ordinary unheroic work of figuring out what a life looked like when it was no longer organized around missions. She had wanted, just for a while, not to be the most capable person in the room and all the weight that came with it. But Aldous had a daughter now, 6 years old, named Rue, who would grow up knowing her father through the things the people who loved him chose to say about him. And there were men going back into the field next month who understood something today that they had not understood 1 week ago. And Strand had, sitting in a car in the gray morning outside a facility at the edge of a 2-lane road, the specific and irreplaceable sense of having done the things she had been built to do. The mission had never been the missions. She had known this for 14 years and needed, every so often, to be reminded. The mission was always the people still ahead. She started the car and drove toward what came next.